Hello everyone, this is Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder organization needs. If you're new here, welcome and we're glad to have you. If you've been here before, welcome back and thanks for your continued support. An interesting conversation I see pop up around spellcasters in Pathfinder is, what is the role of a spellcaster? What are you bringing to the table that is fundamentally different than what a marshal brings to the table? There are a few schools of thought on this matter. The first and most extreme that I wanted to talk about is that casters are cheerleaders, that marshals are supposed to bring damage to the table, and then casters are supposed to enable that damage, and that is their role, that is their job. On the surface, this may even look like a reasonable school of thought. Paizo presents the archetypal party as being a fighter, a rogue, a wizard, and a cleric. If the cleric is healing and buffing, and the wizard is debuffing and controlling, and the fighter and rogue are dealing damage, this seems like the optimal strategy to a lot of people, and it is often presented as such. Suffice it to say, I think it's a little bit of a ridiculous oversimplification to call casters your cheerleaders. I don't even think marshals are dedicated damage dealers. There's plenty of marshals who are healers, controllers, debuffers, and likewise, you can build casters to do very good damage. Perhaps back in 2019, it was quite hard to build a caster to do good damage, but in 2024, with all the buffs that spells received in Rage of Elements and in Player Core 1, and all the buffs that a variety of caster classes received via Errata and Player Core 2, you can build good damage-dealing casters. It's not hard to do so. At best, calling casters cheerleaders is an oversimplification, and at worst, I think it's quite misleading and can harm the new player experience because someone might come into the game and think, I want to play a caster that throws out fireballs, and they're being told they're cheerleaders, but they're not. You could show that casters are not really just cheerleaders. That's not the role of a caster. The second school of thought, and the much more reasonable one in my opinion, is that casters are generalists and marshals are specialists. There's a lot of truth to this school of thought. Marshals are generally expected to be only good at one or two things. A champion really just needs to be using their reaction well and making a few strikes or maneuvers along the way to do well. A fighter just really needs to be hitting people. A monk just needs to be grappling and running around to do well. Casters, on the other hand, because they're capable of picking a wide variety of spells, the game sort of expects them to pick up a wide variety of spells, and thus it kind of naturally pushes them into being generalists. However, I still don't think this is the whole truth. You can build martial all-rounders. You can build a rogue, an investigator, an outwit ranger, a thaumaturge. All of these martials make for really good all-rounders, both in and out of combat. Likewise, while it may not be the most advisable thing to do, you can specialize your casters. It will work. You will be good at the things you choose to specialize in, though it might require some build effort. There's also the hybrids that fall between casters and marshals, like the kineticist, the psychic, the summoner, who kind of blur the lines, and they can either generalize or specialize depending on the exact texture of their class. So it's not the whole truth either. Am I saying there's no difference at all? That casters and marshals are treated identically by the game? Not even slightly. The underlying math, the way the Adventuring Day is designed, all of these things tell you that casters and marshals are different. Why is it that only spellcasters have to deal with daily resource attrition and most marshals don't? Why is it that spellcasters get their proficiencies at a slightly different rate than marshals do? Clearly the game does treat them differently, so it's not true to just say there's no difference. So what is the real answer? What is the role of a spellcaster in Pathfinder 2nd Edition? In my opinion, the role and the real answer lie within the grain of truth inside the cheerleader myth that I poked fun at earlier. Buffing and healing for spellcasters feel incredible in this game, far better than they did back when I used to play 5th edition D&D. Why is that? What is it that the caster is doing that is unique to them? Why is it that the chirurgeon alchemist and the forensic investigator exists, but it's the healing font cleric that's viewed as the archetypal healer, the cheerleader? Why is it that the scoundrel rogue and martial archetype champions can be really good buff and debuff specialists, but it's still the bard's domain when people talk about buffing and debuffing? What are they doing that these martials are failing to do? Before I get into the answer, a small recap of fundamentals. The fundamental differences between marshals and casters in terms of where their power is distributed is that marshals tend to have higher action efficiency and higher resource sustainability. Casters tend to have higher action potency and reliability, and they tend to have a lot of versatility via their spell slots. If you want more details on what each of these terms means, check out the video about the fundamentals of power, which I'll link above. Now, we talked about the versatility part of their role already. Casters are expected to bring their versatility to the table, but this will get incorporated into the larger answer that I'm about to give. The key focus right now is the potency and the reliability. When a marshal like a Carbergian alchemist uses some form of healing, it feels good, but when a cleric casts the heal spell, it feels practically like reversing time. You can get +1s and -1s, and even +2s and -2s when you're acting as a buffer that's not a bard, but when the bard does it, it feels like you're getting to level up your party by almost 2 levels every single time the bard does anything. This explosiveness, this reliability, that is where the role of the caster lies. The caster has 2 roles in context of the average Pathfinder party. Punching above your weight with these explosive and potent spell slots, and fighting back against randomness with both your reliability and the versatility of options you bring to the table. Before delving deeper into the role of a spellcaster and why I'm making the claims that I'm making, I want to take a small aside and talk about how this assumption is directly listed in the GM core. Go to the combat threat section of the game rules on page 75 of the GM core, and you'll find the 5 encounter threat levels: trivial, low, moderate, severe, and extreme. You'll notice that all the combat threat levels except extreme are designed for the players to win. Trivial, low, and moderate are more or less guaranteed victories for parties. Severe encounters, however, add the caveat that bad luck or a lack of resources can turn this encounter deadlier than expected. Likewise, extreme encounters, the only encounter threat level that's designed to be a fair match for the party and not an auto-win, mentions that you shouldn't even consider throwing these at a party that isn't at a comfortable level of daily resources or extremely tactical. See the pattern here? The less likely it is for a party to easily win a fight, the more the game cautions you to account for the party's resources. Extreme encounters are supposed to feel like a 50-50 shot of a TPK unless your casters use their spell slot to punch above their weight and to counteract the inherent randomness of the game. Severe encounters will also end up feeling extreme if you have some reasonably bad luck and your casters need to use their resources to pull the party back. Moderate encounters are an auto-win, but will still drain your HP pools fairly quickly and demand rests right after unless the caster has their reliable spell slots to seal the deal any quicker. The assumption that casters are using their ability to temporarily punch above their weight is embedded into the game's math. This is a D20 game, and D20s are notoriously swingy and fickle. Remember, you only need 1 streak of really bad luck to TPK. In the 200 or so encounters you'll probably have between levels 1 and 20, even if only half of them are moderate or harder, that's still 100 separate encounters where things could go horribly wrong and lead to a character dying or even the whole party dying. The caster is the party's shield against this fickle RNG god. With that, we can sort of circle back to the conversation about cheerleading for a little bit. If the game expects you to be helping your party punch above its weight and to counteract randomness, one of the best ways of doing so, or at least the most straightforward way of doing so, is to buff your friends and to heal those friends. If your friend is going to hit on an 11 and crit on a 20, buffing them to hit on an 8 and crit on an 18 is practically the same as leveling them up by 2. That's punching way above your party's weight. Likewise, if the boss happens to go first because it won initiative and gets multiple back-to-back crits, you're getting unlucky and someone's on death's door. And casting heal is just like saying, nuh-uh, that randomness did not affect us. It feels good, and it is the most straightforward way of filling out the caster's role. The most straightforward option in a game is often viewed as the best option, but that doesn't necessarily mean it is far and away the best option. I'm about to present to you all the other ways in which a caster can help a party punch above its weight while filling out roles that are not buffing or healing. So I'm going to start with something that's not so controversial. Casters are good at debuffing. I don't think most people would disagree with that statement. I think the nuance comes up when a lot of people discuss debuffing They argue that debuffing tends to be a little unreliable compared to just the plain old cheerleader casters we talked about earlier, who just buff and heal. I think that's a little too risk-averse a way of looking at things. Yes, debuffs have a failure chance, but on the flip side, there's a chance that your enemy will get impacted by a more significant debuff than anything you could have an equivalent buff for. As a fairly simple example, if you compare heroism to synesthesia, heroism giving a +2 to attack rolls and saving throws versus synesthesia giving the enemy a -3 to their AC, to their reflex saves, and impacting their vision and impacting their movement speed. Both of these are very good spells. Heroism always works, always gives a +2. Synesthesia sometimes does nothing, but anytime it does something, it has a bigger impact on the battlefield than a heroism might. So debuffs do have their own place. They're like the spiritual inverse of buffing. Buffing is like leveling your friends up. Debuffs level your enemies down. Buffing doesn't have a failure chance. Debuffs have a higher, better than normal outcome chance. And together, they are just part and parcel of the package of spellcasters punching above their weight and being reliable. The other point that is often raised against debuffs is that there exist resourceless options that you can use via skills that supposedly perform better than debuffs. For example, fear versus demoralize. There's the argument that you will succeed on your intimidation check just as often as the enemy succeeds on their saving throw against your fear. This, in my opinion, ignores a very valuable piece of context that success against a saving throw is not the opposite of a success on a skill check. They're not opposites. They're not even related. They're just different things. And an enemy succeeding against a saving throw does not mean you performed poorly, as I'm about to show you. First, let's get the obvious out of the way. Demoralize does win in these two departments, efficiency and sustainability. It does not cost you a daily resource, so it's more sustainable. It costs 1 action, so it's more efficient compared to a 2-action fear. However, fear has very significant upsides in the punching above your weight department and in the reliability department, which we're about to see. Let's say it's a level 1 party fighting a level 3 boss. Your fear would have a DC 17 versus a +9 will save. Assuming a charisma focus, intimidation focus character, you would have a +7 intimidation check versus a 19 will DC. I appreciate that this may not always be the case for your skill user, because a marshal may not have +4 charisma at level 1, but I want to give the skill user all the advantages they can get because they really need them, as you're about to see. So this is the format I'm going to use for comparing outcomes for the rest of this video. Basically, I'm color coding each of the outcomes. Red means unaffected, gold and yellow means frightened 1, green means frightened 2, and blue means frightened 3 and fleeing. I have erased the words success, failure, and critical success because I think they distract from the conversation. You don't need those words to be able to figure out which one is better. So if you look at fear, there's a 15% chance that you will do nothing versus demoralize having a 55% chance of doing nothing. More than 3 times as much, nearly 4 times as much. Then they have the same chance of doing frightened 1, and then fear has a 30% chance of doing frightened 2 versus the 5% chance that demoralize would do the same. Fear is punching so far above demoralize's weight here. You are practically quadrupling and quintupling the success rates of demoralize. It's not even close. And your best case outcome, frightened 3 and fleeing, is better than demoralize's best case outcome, which is just frightened 2, and happens exactly as often. So you punch above your weight, and you're more reliable. And a common refrain used here is that item bonuses would change this math. And no, they don't. So let's take this comparison at level 5 rather than level 1. At this point, the skill user has expert proficiency and has a +1 item bonus, most likely, whereas the caster has still not gained expert proficiency in spell DC, and they don't get item bonuses. So now it's a DC 21 fear versus a +15 will save, and a +14 demoralize versus a DC 25 will. You can see that the gap has closed a little bit. Fear now has a 25% chance of doing nothing, which is still half the chance of the demoralize doing nothing. They still have the same chance of frightened 1, and fear still has a 4 times higher chance of inflicting frightened 2, and has the same chance of doing frightened 3 and fleeing as before. Again, more reliable, punches further up its weight. And remember, this is a bad level for casters. This is the level at which their proficiency is lagging behind the game's math. If we take this to a level that's not intentionally a bit of a caster nerf, like level 7 versus a level 9 boss, now we're looking at a DC 25 Fear versus a plus 18 Will, and a plus 18 Demoralize versus a DC 28 Will. Demoralize went up by more than just 2 levels here because they also gain Master Proficiency. So they still have that same plus 3 worth of bonus I talked about earlier, where they have a higher proficiency and a plus 1 item bonus. The caster just catches right back up despite this Master Intimidation check. The Fear has a 20% chance of doing nothing compared to the 45% chance of Demoralize doing nothing, so we're back to being more than twice as likely to do nothing. The same chance of Frightened 1 as before, and a 5 times higher chance of Frightened 2 comparatively. And again, that unique outcome of Frightened 3 plus Fleeing being as likely as the best case outcome of Demoralize, which is just Frightened 2. Now, another common counterpoint to what I said is that skill feats will significantly close this gap. And they won't. Let me show you why, level by level. At level 2, Intimidating Prowess will give you a plus 2 circumstance bonus to your Demoralize checks. That plus 2 is a 10% shift, which does not make up for the gaps we saw on the past few slides. More importantly, it requires a plus 3 strength, which means either you're picking this on a strength-focused marshal who likely doesn't have as high a charisma as I assumed, or you're picking it on somebody who has a high charisma and then has to be heavily investing in a strength to get here and is sacrificing their defenses to get there. So you're sacrificing the specialize and still not quite catching up. Terrifying resistance, same problem. You're inflicting a -1 on your foe, and then you're getting a +1 circumstance bonus to saves you make against that foe. But the caster might just be inflicting a -2 to everything that foe does, including their DCs, which is better than you getting a +1 circumstance bonus to their saves, because you're actually kind of giving a +1 to all your friends on everything they can do relative to that just the +1 that the marshal will be getting. At level 7, you might pick up Battle Cry, which will let you inflict Frightened 3 or 4 different foes. As a free action, you might get 1, and then each of your 3 actions, you might spend 1 of them on a foe within 30 feet. A 3rd rank Fear can just target 5 enemies. You will get all those better outcomes and better reliability that I talked about on the previous slide against all 5 of those enemies. Remember the multinomial distribution that I talk about in a lot of my previous videos. It's going to make it so you're much likelier to see those extreme outcomes. You're going to see lots of Frightened 2 and potentially a Frightened 3 and Fleeing when you do this. Terrified Retreat, it's barely comparable to the crit fail effect of a Fear, because all you're doing is upgrading your crit success, which is still going to be worse than the critical failure effect of Fear. At level 15, you'll pick Scare to Death, and you'll finally have something unique that the caster can't just outdo, because you might insta-kill a minion that you demoralize. Now, the only thing is, casters are incredible at dealing with minions. You're finally overtaking what their 1st rank Fear would have done against that minion, but you don't need to be overtaking their 1st rank Fear at this point. You're at level 15. The caster can do a lot of other things that bully minions. They can cast Vision of Death. Just like with the Battlecry example, when it lost to a 3rd rank Fear, this loses to a lot of higher rank spells after barely managing to overtake this 1st rank spell. And against a boss, it doesn't really help. All it does is give you a 2nd Demoralize, because the incapacitation means you will never get an outcome better than Demoralize would have gotten you anyways. All you're really doing is bypassing the immunity 1 time. But let's go all out. Let's find a level where the caster's advantages are as low as possible, and let's do everything in our power to stack the deck against the caster. Level 18 Party, level 20 Boss. I chose level 18 on purpose because casters do not have legendary proficiency yet. At level 19, this is not going to be the same story. Let's assume that the caster has their DC 40 Unspeakable Shadow versus a plus 34 Will. I'm assuming the enemy has a plus 33 Will and a +1 status bonus against magic to stack the deck even further against the caster. Meanwhile, let's assume the marshal has been hit with a maximum rank heroism and has been given a critical success aid by somebody else with legendary demoralized proficiency. So you have a plus 42 to your check against the DC 43 Will. And finally, we have found a scenario where the marshal was able to be more reliable than the caster, right? You can see that Unspeakable Shadow is 5 times likelier to do nothing compared to Demoralize. Only after the marshal was given a +7 worth of bonuses from others. That would have cost your party 3 actions and a reaction to be able to aid and heroism you, and a 9th rank spell slot. And if you didn't have those, you would actually still be less reliable than the Unspeakable Shadow, despite all the other advantages we gave. On top of that, your outcomes are actually still worse than the caster, other than the fact that you are less likely to do nothing in this case. Frightened 1 is worse than Frightened 2. And then while you inflict Frightened 2 roughly as often as the caster inflicts Frightened 2 as well, the caster might inflict Frightened 3 or 4. And that's not even getting to the best part. Unspeakable Shadow doesn't just inflict Frightened, it drains actions away from the enemy because they're forced to attack their own shadow or run away from their own shadow for every turn that they're frightened. The green bar is not just Frightened 2, it's Frightened 2 and Slowed 1 for 2 turns. The blue bar is Frightened 3 and Slowed 1 for 3 turns, and Frightened 4 is that much more slowed. And that's not something the Marshal is even coming close to comparing to. All in all, we gave the Marshal as many bonuses as possible. They finally overtook just the reliability portion and still couldn't punch nearly as far above their weight as they could. And again, if we take away the heroism or take away the aid, any one of those things, suddenly the Demoralize is not going to be more reliable anyways. That red bar will fill right back up to 20% or 25%. So at almost every stage of the game, practically every stage of the game, the caster's spell slot punched above the party's weights. The caster's spell slots were more reliable. The debuffs the caster inflicted made everyone else more reliable. You're inflicting larger debuffs, you're doing them more often, and everything you're doing is helping your party punch above their weight as well. Debuffing as a caster helps you fulfill that role. It fits exactly in the paradigm I talked about. It lets the caster be anti-randomness and anti-threat for the party. It lets them have higher potency and higher reliability. In that final slide, the skill was being helped by 4 actions and a reaction, and a 9th rank spell slot. Demoralize is 1 action, Aid is an action and a reaction, Heroism is 2 actions, and a 9th rank spell slot. And the skill was only barely able to overtake the spell's reliability, and still wasn't able to keep up with the spell's potency. But imagine if instead of aiding the Marshal, we had aided the caster there. We used the Bond mode to make their Unspeakable Shadow more reliable. We used Recall Knowledge to see if instead of Unspeakable Shadow, they should be casting something else that targets Reflex or Fortitude. There'll be more on this in part 2. For now, we're just going to talk about how casters are filling out their roles by beating randomness and punching above the party's weight. Now it's time for the spicy take. Caster damage is also a way of punching above your weight and punching reliably above your weight. Some might look at everything I've said so far and say, well, debuffing is still cheerleading, all that makes sense, but casters can't do damage, Marshals do strictly better damage. Untrue. Marshal damage is not strictly better. Marshal damage has its own downsides relative to caster damage. Caster damage does let you punch above your level's weight if you're using a spell slot on it. Caster damage is more reliable, even if you're not using a spell slot on it. Your focus spells and cantrips will tend to be more reliable than a Marshal's damage. There is one caveat. You have to compare to a ranged Marshal. Melee Marshals get a lot of privileges. In Melee, there are a lot of hidden tactical downsides. You can see my video on range versus melee to see in detail what I'm talking about, but the point is that you have to compare range to get a real apples-to-apples comparison. My math for this will not be on as many levels as I showed you for debuffing. Sorry, the video would be ridiculously long if I did that. So we will be comparing single target damage between a spellcaster and a marshal. This is not as simple as a skill versus a spell comparison. There's a lot of confounding factors. Skill versus spell both have 3 different outcomes that directly compare. Frightened 1, Frightened 2, Frightened 3, and also nothing happens. And it was okay to just caveat that by saying that Fear requires 2 actions and Demoralize requires 1 action. In the case of strikes versus spells that do damage, I don't think we can compare just 1 strike because that kind of makes it look like the Marshals are a lot more reliable than they are because of the multiple attack penalty. If you just compare 1 strike, you're always looking at a Marshal's highest accuracy, but the Marshal's not always attacking with that highest accuracy. So let's compare 2 actions spells versus 2 actions of strikes. The problem there is that a spell has 4 degrees of success, and then 2 strikes have 9 outcomes because you can go miss, miss, miss hit, miss, crit, all permutations of that, and that ends up being 9 outcomes. How do we do this comparison in a meaningful fashion? Well, obviously the way to compare is DPR, right? No, it isn't. DPR tells us about sustained round after round damage over a longer combat, but that doesn't actually tell us about how far above your weight a caster helped you punch. It doesn't tell us about how reliable they were, because DPR is just kind of a flat number with very little context. So first, we're going to set up a scenario. This is at level 7, so the caster will be using a 2-action, 4th rank Thunderstrike. Thunderstrike is a premier single target damage spell. The fighter is a ranged composite shortbow using fighter. They will make 2 strikes with a +1 striking astral composite shortbow, and they'll have +4 strength, the highest they could possibly have at this level. Now we want to define equivalent outcomes, just like how in the first scenario we had nothing happens, frightened 1, frightened 2, and frightened 3 as these outcomes that we were comparing. We want something like that. So in this case, the outcomes are going to be bad, medium, good, and great. Bad is the 0 damage outcome. Critical success against a spell or 2 straight misses on your bow. Medium is a success against a spell or 1 hit and 1 miss in either order. That's 18 versus 15.5 average damage. And then in these next 2 outcomes, good and great, I want you to notice that I have lumped together 2 sets of martial outcomes. I have lumped together 2 hits with 1 crit and 1 miss, and I've lumped together 1 crit, 1 hit, and 2 crits. These are combined into 2 separate groups. The lumping is to some extent arbitrary, but if you look at the numbers, you can see why I did it. I wanted to define outcomes that are clearly better than the ones below them. Like 51 average damage is clearly better than 35.5 average damage, whereas 35.5 average damage is not that far from 31. However, I also wanted to emphasize that in these little buckets, the smaller number, the 31 or the 51, will be the more frequent outcomes, because 2 hits happens more frequently than 1 crit and 1 miss. 1 crit and 1 hit happens more frequently than 2 crits. So you can already start to see that as soon as we define these buckets, the martial is lagging behind in potency a little. You can generally expect the spell will do more damage because its equivalent outcomes just have a bigger portion of their bucket dedicated to that higher damage. How are we going to calculate the probabilities of this 1 hit, 1 miss, or 2 hit, or 1 crit, 1 miss, and in any order, right? You can do 1 hit followed by a miss, or a miss followed by a hit, and they all have the multiple attack penalty. This is something that you can do using conditional probability, which I will make a detailed video on in the future, but basically you can take the odds of hitting on your first attack, or missing on your first attack, or critting on your first attack, and then multiply it by the odds of doing that for the second attack. So the odds might look like something what I put on the screen, and then when you multiply them in the right orders, you will end up getting the outcome you're looking for. You can check my math for me and let me know if I got anything wrong, though I'm fairly confident in it. With all that setup out of the way, we're finally ready to start looking at the numbers. So this is a level 7 party, level 9 boss. As always, I like to look at a boss 2 levels above the party when thinking about reliability and potency, because that's the sort of frequent fight where punching above your weight and being reliable matters the most. Let's look at DC 25 for the spellcaster versus a +18 reflex saving throw, which is moderate for the level. And then the fighter has a +18 to hit, +13 after multiple attack penalty, versus a 28 AC. All in all, that's what the numbers look like. The bad outcome of nothing at all happening, Thunderstrike gets it 20% of the time, 2 strikes from the fighter gets it around 32% of the time. Thunderstrike sees a successful saving throw 50% of the time, and 2 strikes sees it around 46% of the time. And then there's a good and the great outcomes, which is a failure and critical failure from Thunderstrike respectively, and getting some combinations of back-to-back hits or crits for the 2 strikes. And it is worth noting here that while the green bucket for Thunderstrike may only look a little bit bigger, and then the blue bucket is a minuscule amount bigger, that green bucket contains both the chance of doing 31 damage and 35 damage on average, because you either hit twice or you crit once. The 2 hits outcome is more frequent. Likewise, the blue bucket contains the chance of 2 back-to-back crits, which is a tiny chance. I think it's 0.25% versus getting a crit and a hit, which is I think around 4%. So for both the green bucket and the blue bucket, a much larger portion of the bucket has a much lower potency than the fail or the critical fail of a Thunderstrike respectively, and that's worth noting too. So Thunderstrike is winning in both potency and reliability. And this may be surprising to a few of my viewers because casters are often viewed as being less potent at damage, but it's not the case. When you use a spell slot, you will punch above your weight. But Mathfinder, the fighter, has feats. Okay, let's take a fighter using double shot on a single target. This is something they can do at level 7 because if you have triple shot, you get a rider that says your double shot can now be used against a single target. So instead of plus 18 and plus 13 for successive attacks, you have plus 16 and plus 16. Not much of a difference. The numbers actually look very similar to before. There's a slight increase in reliability, but not so much as to actually catch up to Thunderstrike. And of course, if we're assuming feats, then we should also be assuming that the caster has feats and class features, right? I just threw a Thunderstrike out on a generic classless caster, but that's not what casters are. That Thunderstrike could have come from a metal elemental sorcerer with sorceress potency and blood magic, and then the outcomes will get a +0, +2, +8, and +16 damage boosts respectively for bad, medium, good, and great. That will trump the potency of the fighter even more thoroughly. Even in the case where the fighter gets the improbable outcomes of back-to-back crits, you would still be doing significantly more damage than the fighter would. Likewise, we could compare 3 actions versus 3 actions. Maybe the fighter comes out ahead in that case. I don't really want to get into comparing 3 action versus 3 action here because the permutations get a little intense, but just suffice it to say that most damage-focused casters have a third action that adds reliable damage. Like, it's not hard to get that. At the most baseline case, you could just pick up a bow, but you don't have to. Metal sorcerers have the elemental toss cantrip. Wizards can have force bolt or hand of the apprentice. Psychics can have their psi burst option. There are many options to do reliable third action damage, and because your 2 actions come from a spell, you can go through your entire turn without ever suffering multiple attack penalty. So really, no one other than the Flurry Ranger is probably going to approach the 3 action reliability of a caster, and maybe they will approach the potency, but I don't think that's a guarantee. And now, just to be a little complete with damage, I'm going to drop an ice cold take. Caster AoE is good. No, but it's actually a lot better than a lot of people think caster AoE is. However, that's something for a future video because I need to come up with a good way of representing how damage is done because DPR doesn't capture how good AoE is, and the method I use in the previous slides would be monumentally difficult when applied to 3 targets. So that is a topic for a future video. Aside from casters having reliable and potent single target damage and just having insanely good AoE, there's other caster advantages to damage too. You can bypass resistances. You can exploit weaknesses. You can ignore cover most of the time because unless you're targeting AC or making a reflex attack that goes in a straight line towards them from your line of effect, you just ignore cover. You might be able to target a low save, which would make you even more reliable than numbers I showed before, which assumed moderate save. You can easily inflict riders. Instead of Thunderstrike, you could have been looking at something like Acid Grip, Ignite Fireworks, Dehydrate. There's lots of ways for spellcasters to inflict riders while also doing decent, at least, damage. And finally, casters abuse 3 offensively oriented actions way better than martials do, as I hinted to in the previous slide. Can this be yet another way to help casters? Like I said, my next video is going to go in depth on how to help casters as a martial. But Mathfinder, you use the max rank spell slot. Those run out. They do, but that slot got to punch above its weight. Remember, my argument here is not that casters are just better than martials or that martials are useless. Martials are more sustainable. However, the caster is getting to punch above its weight anytime it's using those unsustainable resources. If you're spending a resource, you'll get to punch above your weight and you'll get to be reliable. It is worth noting, however, that even if you're focusing on just being a damage dealer, there's plenty of ways for casters to bring value. First off, think of severe or extreme fights. Like I said, the game sort of expects the caster to be punching above their weight. Martials don't have a way to dial it up. Their performance in a low threat fight is no different than their performance in an extreme threat fight, really, aside from probably taking more damage and having to be more careful. So arguably it's less in extreme fights. They have no way of at will dialing up their performance. Casters have resources. They get to control their output. They get to say, this is an important fight, and that is in itself valuable. So even if you're focusing on just burst damage spell slots like the Thunderstrike I mentioned, only using it in severe and extreme fights already adds a lot of value, because those are the fights that TPK you. Those are the fights that kill someone. And those are the fights where you punch above your weight and fix that problem. There's also the fact that casters don't have to focus on burst damage. Burst damage was just what I used to illustrate my point. You can use, for example, a floating flame on turn 1, and then instead of your damage being high on turn 1 and abysmal later, it can be good on turn 1, and then every time you sustain the spell in the future, you'll do some poke damage, and you'll combine that with a lower rank Thunderstrike, or some focus spells, or some cantrips. I looked at a Metal Elemental Sorcerer in my previous example because those have the Elemental Toss, but I could have looked instead at a Storm Druid who can Thunderstrike on turn 1, and then Tempest Surge on turn 2 and turn 3, and still do pretty good damage. So all is not lost once you've spent that spell slot. I don't think it's as big of a cost as people often make it out to be. And conversely, I think for the cost it is, it gets to do a lot. But Mathfinder, martial attacks can be buffed and enemy AC can be debuffed. You're right. But as we established, those debuffs and buffs come best from a caster that punches above their weight. No matter how you look at it, a spell is what punched above your weight. Casters can be buffing or debuffing. That's why the martial attack or the enemy AC was buffed or debuffed to the level that it looked like your character leveled up a couple levels, right? Or they can deal damage, which is going to be more reliable and more potent than what a martial can do. So regardless, it kind of fits into the point I'm making. The last topic I wanted to talk about is control spells. But before we even talk about that, we have to establish what control is, because a lot of people define it in a lot of different ways. And importantly, how is control different than debuffs? People draw the line in different places. There's a lot of subjectivity to it, and I'm not trying to say that my way of drawing this line is 100% correct, but it is the way I look at it, and that's the terminology I'll be using. So when I say control, I mean the spell is doing one of three things. The first is defeat in detail, more colloquially known as divide and conquer. Anytime you're using an option in a way that it lets you treat an encounter as several back-to-back easier encounters, you're inflicting control. This is a very effective strategy because 2 back-to-back 80 XP encounters is a lot easier than one 160 XP encounter, isn't it? 2 moderates versus 1 extreme. I would take 2 moderates any day, even if I don't get to heal between them. The next thing is area denial. Anytime you are using either pre-existing terrain or your spells and or some combination thereof to force your enemy into a certain area, or you're using your reactions and other such options to control where they can stand, where they can go, whom they can threaten, that is a form of control. And finally, force movement. This is kind of like the default option for control, where, yeah, that's control. You're literally controlling the movement of the opponent. There's not much else to it. Spells like Acid Grip, Containment, Wall of Stone are very transparently control options, aren't they? Containment will let you do defeat in detail. Wall of Stone can do area denial or defeat in detail. Acid Grip is force movement. Sometimes spells cross the line over with debuffs. Ash Cloud, Hypnotize, Freezing Rain. These can do double duty as debuffs or area denial, depending on how you look at it. Again, the line is hazy. There is a line somewhere that most people will draw. I am just choosing to say anytime I'm using one of these, I'm going to call it control. The main thing about control is that all of these options, especially defeat in detail, but all of them, lower encounter difficulty. You're going to take on an encounter as if you had some advantages built into the XP budget. You might make the terrain favor you. You might forcibly move enemies into terrain that is unfavorable to them. You will literally split them and defeat them in detail. So now that I have sort of maybe kind of somewhat vaguely defined what control is, how do you begin comparing them? That's even more vague, isn't it? How do you compare skills to spells for control? How do you even compare spells to spells for control? I'm choosing 2 somewhat arbitrary points of comparison. One is something you've seen before, and I'll just point you to the video when that comes up. The other is for this video. So this is Containment versus Grapple, my first point of comparison, and you are going to think I'm unhinged for suggesting this. You might be wondering why we don't just choose a spell that actually inflicts the grabbed or restrained condition, but when you think about it, Containment and Grapple fulfill the same purpose. You want to restrict enemy mobility, force them to attack suboptimal targets, or not be able to attack their optimal targets, force them to inflict the multiple attack penalty on themselves and spend an action getting out of these conditions you threw on them. They're very similar. The only real difference is Containment kind of fully locks the enemy out. Grapple doesn't lock them out unless you restrain them, but conversely, Grapple also has higher upside if you do restrain them, so it's a little hazy, but it works. Why am I not using something else like, say, slow versus trip? Because in my opinion, it's even harder to define equivalent outcomes for those. I think Containment and Grapple have a pretty good selection of equivalent outcomes. The second point of comparison is Acid Grip versus Shove or Reposition. This is not unhinged, and this is something you've seen before in a video linked above. I won't be going into depth on this in this, but the conclusion of that video was that Acid Grip is more potent and more reliable than Shove and Reposition. Fits into the data points of this video. Now for Containment versus Grapple, we want to start defining those equivalent outcomes I've been talking about. So let's pretend the Grapple cannot critically fail, just for the sake of convenience and to make it a little more fair for the Grapple, I guess. The bad outcome is nothing happening. The enemy critically succeeded against Containment, or you failed on the Grapple. The good outcome is a successful save or a successful Grapple check. Either way, what you've done is put the enemy in a position where you got most of the effect you wanted. In Containment, the enemy will probably escape in one attempt, so they'll make one attack and get out of it, but until they do that, they're hard locked out of the combat. In Grapple, they might get out in one attempt, they might get out in two attempts, they may not get out at all, but because of that risk, they're also not hard locked out of the battle. They can still just attack their grappler. They can make range attacks against foes that are far away with a flat check. They can cast spells with a flat check. And then there's the great outcome. It's a failure against Containment, or a critical success on the Grapple. In the case of Containment, the enemy will now take 2 to 4 actions to get out of the Containment alone. And in the case of Grapple, you have now hard locked the enemy because they cannot take attack trait or manipulate trait actions, they can barely even shove you, they can't attack anyone, and they can't cast spells. Yeah, blurry lines when comparing them. I think the equivalencies mostly work. As always, we'll be taking a level 7 party and a level 9 boss. The Containment has a DC of 25, and I'm assuming a plus 21 reflex. I'm assuming plus 18 athletics because, again, master proficiency, maxed out strength, item bonus, and 25 fortitude. You will note that I assumed high reflex and low fortitude. I gave this to the grappler just to show you how much better control can be. This is what the mat looks like. Containment is slightly likely to have the bad outcome, 5% likelier, and thus 5% less likely to have the great outcome, and otherwise they're neck and neck, they're tied. While I assume that the grappler had that plus 6 worth of DC differential benefiting them because I assumed high reflex and low fortitude. You flip the script, you say high fortitude and low reflex, so now it's DC 25 Containment versus plus 15 reflex, and plus 18 athletics versus DC 28 fortitude. It's not even close. Containment pulls out so far ahead. Containment now basically has a non-existent chance that the enemy is going to fully escape from the Containment right as you cast it. Most of the time they'll be trapped, and a very, very, very high chunk of the time they're going to be trapped for 2 to 4 actions, which can be multiple turns. That's devastating. Casting this on an enemy is akin to putting them on a wall of stone. They just don't say wall of stone. Likewise, the grappler has a very high chance of doing nothing, and most of the time when they don't get the do nothing outcome, they're just grabbing the enemy. It's not like they restrain them, it's a little less restrictive than what the Containment would achieve. So again, not the most perfect comparison, but I hope it illustrates what I mean when I say Containment used as a control tool is going to vastly outpace athletics used as a control tool. And as before, this might raise the question, what about skill feats and other boosts that you might get from your class? It's the same story as the debuffs. Skill feats might give you a boost, but so would leveling up your spells. by the time you've actually got enough of the skill feats to catch up, the spellcaster wouldn't be using Containment. They'd use Wall of Stone or Lifewood Cage, which would punch so far above the weight of anything a skill feat could do. Likewise, you might assume the marshal might have class features boosting their attempts to grapple. For example, a monk with Flurry of Maneuvers or Mix Maneuver. Casters can also get certain boosts from their class features. You might be a Lore Oracle who can just figure out your enemy's weakness, figure out their weakest save, and then just target it. You might be an Imperial Sorcerer who can just give your enemy an arbitrary negative to their DC. You might be a wizard who has spell substituted to have the right spell for the right time for your enemy because you scouted ahead, saw what the battlefield looked like, and picked control spells suited to this battlefield. Class features benefit both marshals and casters, and thus don't make up the difference that we're seeing in the raw spell versus the raw skill in this case. So same as before, a spell is gonna punch above its weight, add reliability to the party. It's always the same story. So to conclude, what is the role of a caster? What is the answer to the question we've been asking this whole time? It's to help the party punch above their weight. It's to help the party overcome randomness. When you're in a severe encounter, when you're in an extreme encounter, casters are the only ones who can dial it up, who can arbitrarily say, I want to perform better. Marshals, with the exception of a couple that have daily resources, don't really get to do that. Likewise, when the party is getting really unlucky, you're the only one that can say, you know what, I wasn't planning on punching so far above my weight, but I'm gonna go Nova because we've been getting really unlucky. Again, people without spell slots usually don't get to do that. It doesn't matter if you're healing, buffing, debuffing, blasting, controlling, or doing any mix thereof. You're always doing these two roles as a caster, and that is the whole impetus for bringing a caster to a party. That's what the designers mean when they say that the game is balanced with the assumption of a fighter, a rogue, a cleric, and a wizard. The rogue and the fighter will bring efficiency and sustainability, but the wizard and the cleric are the ones punching above their weight and countering randomness whenever those really hard encounters come up. Is this compatible with the cheerleader caster? Yes. I keep poking fun at that, but obviously there's some truth to the cheerleader caster myth. It's just that it goes beyond that. You don't have to be a cheerleader. Cheerleading is a very good way of punching above the party's weight and overcoming randomness, but you can do anything to do so. Is this compatible with a generalist caster? Absolutely, yes. Being a generalist is a way to overcome randomness and to punch above your weight. Let's say that your GM has decided to throw a flying enemy at you. You use Earthbind, you use Falling Sky, you use Fly or Airwalk. Any number of these things suddenly even the odds that were set against you. They help your party not be punching below their weight. They help your fighter not have to swap to their backup bow where they're now at a -4 to hit compared to usual and doing a quarter as much damage as they would otherwise do. Likewise, it might help you overcome randomness because you might know certain weaknesses of the enemy, and because you're a generalist, you might be able to target them better. Let's say you're fighting a frog hemoth, and it's a severe or extreme encounter, but you know that they have that weird electricity weakness that frog hemoths have, and because you're a generalist, you brought electricity to the table, so you will just trivialize the encounter and punch way above your weight by doing so. So yes, it is compatible with a generalist caster. Being a generalist is a way of fulfilling the role of a caster. That'll be all for today's video, folks. I hope I have convinced some of you, or hopefully a lot of you, of this idea that's been brewing in my mind lately, that casters don't just have any one defined role. They're not just buffers or just debuffers, they're even just generalists. There's a lot of depth into what defines a caster in Pathfinder, and I hope that this helps you carve out your own role when you're playing a caster in a party in the future. My next video is going to be something a little bit related and a little bit spicy. I wanted to delve into how you can cheerlead for your casters, because I often see people talking about how you can't buff a caster, only casters can buff you, therefore it's the caster's job to buff you. And no, I want to push back against that. If the caster's role is to punch above their weight and do all these things that I talked about today, then what can you as a non-caster do to help those casters achieve that role? But that's a topic for the next video. For now, if you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. If you agree or disagree with anything I said, please feel free to comment. I'm always happy to discuss, and I love discussing these topics with you, and I love musing about game design with all of you. See you next time!